Way back in 1979, at the address of 284 Green Street, Enfield, lived a single mother, Peggy Hodgson, and her children. The children included two young girls, Margaret aged 14 and Janet aged 11, and her sons, Johnny aged 10 and Billy aged 7. The activity started one night as the children were upstairs getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, Peggy could hear a lot of banging and screaming coming from the girls' bedroom. She rushed into the room to tell the girls to keep it down, only to see them sitting there terrified, staring at a set of heavy drawers that had been moved from their usual position to the middle of the room. The girls swore it had moved on its own, but Peggy didn't believe the girls and attempted to push the heavy set of drawers back into place. After quite a bit of effort, the drawers were back against the wall, and Peggy, now out of breath, turned to her children and insisted they stop messing around and get ready for bed. At that instant, the set of drawers flew from the wall right back into the middle of the room as Peggy, Janet and Margaret were left frozen in fear. This was followed by a loud, unsettling knocking coming from all the walls in the room surrounding them. The family quickly fled the house screaming in nothing but their pyjamas and ran across the road and banged on the door of the neighbours, Vic and Peggy Nottingham. And the family frantically explained what had just happened to them in the upstairs bedroom. Now, Vic Nottingham was not the kind of man to skirt easily, and volunteered to go over to the Hodgson residence to investigate. And so they all returned back to the house, including the Hodgson family, who insisted that they stay downstairs while Vic searched the upstairs rooms. He inspected the dark, empty rooms and noticed the knocking sound following him around the house in every room. A little spooked, he went back down the stairs to talk to the Hodgson family. What we need to keep in mind is that Vic was a builder by trade and knew a thing or two about household plumbing, but he admitted that he couldn't blame the knocking noises on old water pipes or creaky floorboards. As Vic and the family stood there in the living room trying to think up some kind of rational explanation for the activity that had just happened, another 3 bangs came from directly above their heads. It was coming from the upstairs bedroom. Vic couldn't help but look shaken and suggested that they ring the police. When the police arrived, you can imagine their initial reaction to the whole story and suggested that maybe it was nothing more than a prank the children were playing on the mother. As the police officer WPC Carolyn Heaps asked her questions, she was horrified to see an old wooden chair slide across the floor with no assistance at all, pushed by invisible hands. In a later television interview with WPC Carolyn Heaps, she describes how the chair did indeed move across the floor a couple of feet, and was definitely not pushed. And then she goes on to explain how she tried in vain to debunk what had just happened and what she had seen with her own 2 eyes, but in the end she had no explanation. Now, what I find interesting about this is the fact that a police officer with such a respectable career would risk ridicule on television, and I think this only adds more credence to the case. As you can imagine, there wasn't much the police could do, and they had no choice but to leave the house after making sure one more time that there were no intruders in there. WPC Carolyn Heaps made the suggestion that they seek out other forms of help, and at a loss and not knowing where to turn to next, Peggy and the Nottinghams decided to see if the British tabloids could help. Graham Morris, a photographer, and Douglas Bent, a journalist for the Daily Mail newspaper, arrived at the Hodgson's house and was welcomed by a tired-looking Peggy. Peggy invited the photographer and the journalist into the house and explained what had been going on. And so they came in, they sat down, and there they stayed for a few hours in the house waiting for something to happen. Cameras at the ready, waiting to capture anything paranormal. But of course, nothing happened, and the 2 men became more and more impatient, and they came to the conclusion that they had wasted their time, and they prepared to leave. Feeling like their afternoon had been totally wasted, Douglas and Graham left the house. As Graham was loading the equipment into his car, Vic came running out, urging them both to return to the house right away. As they opened the door, they could see Peggy and her children in hysterics, trying to get out of the way of multiple objects that flew around the house, such as Lego bricks, marbles and ashtrays that smashed and rebounded off the walls. Graham backed himself up into a corner of the room and proceeded to take pictures. As he was doing so, he was hit on the forehead by a Lego brick that hit him so hard it left a mark. Abruptly, the activity ended, leaving everyone in the room very shaken and silent. Unfortunately, the photographs taken showed no evidence of what had just occurred. This frustrated Graham and Douglas and only encouraged them to try and capture some hard evidence. But to do so, they would need more help from someone who knew a little more about the paranormal than they did. And so they decided to reach out to the Society of Psychical Research, and they sent out their newest member, who was an inventor and a paranormal investigator, and his name was Maurice Grosse. Initially, Maurice was unsure what to make of the claims of the haunting, thinking it all may be a hoax, or maybe the family wanted their 5 minutes of fame with the tabloids. But after a few nights and after witnessing some strange happenings in the house, he became convinced that this was all worthwhile and suggested this was all down to a poltergeist. Maurice decided he would need more help and invited writer and journalist Guy Lyon Playfair to join the investigation, due to his background in paranormal investigations. Over the next 14 months, the investigators ended up spending the majority of their time staying with the family to comfort and to try and capture some sort of evidence of poltergeist activity. It wasn't long before the supposed haunting caught the eye of the BBC radio service, who sent out Ros Morris to investigate the story that was capturing the attention of Britain. On her first night staying in the haunted house, she sat downstairs in the living room with Maurice as he filled her in on the investigation so far, as the family slept upstairs. As they sat in the living room, there came a loud bang coming from Janet and Margaret's room. Ros and Maurice rushed up to find the girls in a deep sleep, and a chair that was originally standing next to Janet's bed thrown over in the middle of the room. With shaking hands, Ros brought out her microphone and started to document what had just happened, whilst the girls were still fast asleep. Not long after this incident, the activity in the house started to escalate, and the family no longer felt safe sleeping in separate bedrooms, and now they slept in the same room every night. One night, Janet informed her mother that she could hear a scraping sound coming from the fireplace that was upstairs in the bedroom. The scraping turned into a loud vibrating noise, like the walls were coming down around them. Guy rushed into the bedroom just in time to see the fireplace being ripped out of the wall by some invisible force, and then flung over the bed and coming down to the ground in a tremendous crash, leaving everyone in the room shocked and terrified. Maurice would later comment on the sheer weight of the gas fire and that he could not lift it, so there was no possibility two young girls could either. All the activity seemed to occur even more so around the youngest daughter, Janet. Grosse thought this was probably due to puberty, and this is an ongoing theory around poltergeist cases, that the poltergeist somehow feed off energy of a child that is going through puberty. Grosse decided to have Janet tested for any chance that she could perhaps influence metal to move or to vibrate it or bend it like the famous spoon bender Uri Geller. Janet was told to place her hand 6 inches away from the spoon with no touching. Within a minute or so, the spoon did indeed begin to bend, and by the end of the experiment, the spoon was successfully bent fully, with no touch from Janet at all. Guy Lyon Playfair had a theory that the activity could be due to the breakup of Peggy and her husband, leaving Peggy with the children to bring up alone, with very little money coming into the house, creating a very unhappy home, creating the perfect environment for a haunting. 2 months after the first incident, the activity carried on, increasing in volume as time went on. Thumping, knocking noises coming from all over the house on every wall, which was caught on tape on many occasions. October rolled around and the nights were getting darker as the occurrences got stronger and stronger, and this was seriously taking its toll on the family. Maurice decided to send the family away on holiday to Clacton-on-Sea to give them a well-deserved break. The holiday was delightful, and a certain weight had been lifting, but unknown to Peggy and the children, their behaviour was going to return with a vengeance as soon as they got home. One night as the girls slept, they were awoke by once again loud banging coming from the bedroom floor. Maurice entered the room to calm the girls and decided to try and communicate with the knocking. He asked aloud if the invisible culprit of the knocking could answer with 1 knock for no and 2 knocks for yes, and then he went on to ask this so-called ghost the following questions. Maurice's first question to the poltergeist was if it had died in the house. Maurice didn't get 1 knock or 2, he got a total of 53 knocks. This annoyed Maurice, who then asked if the spirit was playing some sort of game with him. Suddenly, a box from the corner of the room flew into the air and hit Maurice square in the face, and then followed by a pillow. It would seem that this poltergeist had a little bit of an attitude. 3 months into the case, Janet's behaviour started to concern everyone. She started drawing disturbing pictures, and she also started to go into a trance-like state and have fits, and sometimes she would start to bang her head against the walls. Maurice became worried that she may injure herself, and a doctor was called, After the doctor's checkup, he decided to give Janet a sedative to calm her, and she was sent to bed. Later that night, Janet would awake from a sedated sleep in pure darkness and pure terror, screaming for help as she realised she'd been placed from her bed on top of the radio player, which was sitting on top of the chest of drawers. This was witnessed by her uncle as he entered the room to help her down. Normally when the children went to bed, Maurice would set up audio recording equipment in their rooms to try and catch any unexplained noises that may occur during the night. One incident that was caught on audio tape by Maurice involved Janet asleep in bed when she was suddenly dragged out of her bed by invisible ice-cold hands and dragged across the bedroom floor and out of her room and thrown from the top of the stairs headfirst to the bottom. Although Janet was very shaken up, she wasn't too badly injured. Now, Graham Morris decided to set up a video camera in the girls' bedroom in hope of catching anything paranormal that might happen again. Also, this video recording equipment was remote control, so people downstairs could actually move the cameras around in the bedroom whenever they heard any kind of noise. This video camera apparently captured Janet being thrown against her will on a few occasions across her room. Janet was also once seen by the local baker who was passing by the house when he heard a great commotion coming from Janet's bedroom window. He looked up to see Janet floating as well as a few of her toys around the room in a horizontal position, floating up and down. This was also witnessed by the lollipop lady who was standing across the street. One particular night, the family and Maurice were sitting in the living room when all of a sudden a loud dog bark sounded out in the room. This would have been totally fine if the Hodgsons owned a dog, but they didn't. Maurice decided to try once more to communicate with the spirit as the girls lay in bed, and when he asked the spirit to communicate, another loud dog bark rang out in the bedroom. Maurice composed himself and then asked the spirit to say his name, and it did, in a very rough, gravelly voice which seemed like it was coming from Janet. The next day, Roz returned from the BBC and set up her audio recorder and had a conversation with the supposed spirit coming through Janet's vocal cords. The following is a recording of that actual conversation taken from a Channel 4 documentary.
Talk to Roz, she wants to talk to you.
Hello. Good evening. Good evening. Are there two of you there?
Yeah.
What are you called?
Somebody.
Where's Harry? That's a joke, isn't it?
The voice coming from Janet was under speculation. Many believed that she was making this up and faking the voice. And with Peggy's permission, Maurice decided to put this to the test by making Janet hold a mouthful of water in her mouth, and then he covered up her lips with tape. He then went on to ask the spirit questions, to which it answered through Janet's vocal cords just as before. And when Maurice removed the tape from Janet's mouth, she spat out all of the water. This to Maurice was undeniable proof that this was indeed paranormal. More conversations with the spirit came in the following days, but there was still a doubt in everybody's mind whether Janet was actually telling the truth and not playing a prank, even though she swore it wasn't her speaking. But one conversation that the spirit had with Maurice through Janet's vocal cords had some shocking, undeniable facts about a previous resident of the house that Janet could not have known about. Maurice has spoken with the spirit that was coming through Janet's vocal cords on many occasions, but one day they had a breakthrough when the spirit told Maurice Gross that its name was Bill Wilkins. Maurice decided to invite his son Richard Gross to try his hand at interrogating the spirit to see if he had any more luck where Maurice was failing. Richard asked one simple question. He asked the spirit that they all knew now as Bill if he remembered what had happened to him when he died, and the answer he got from the spirit was astounding. The spirit, or Bill, answered in what Richard describes as a gruff, gravelly voice of an old man that no 11-year-old girl was capable of replicating. Here is another audio clip from the Channel 4 documentary that recorded that conversation.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died. I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died in a chair in a corner downstairs.
Now, I don't know if you can make out the audio from that clip, but what the spirit actually said is, I went blind and I had a hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs. Now, after a bit of investigating with the council, they discovered that the last occupier of the house was indeed a Mr. Bill Wilkins. And to put the icing on the cake, Maurice tracked down Bill's son, Terry Wilkins, who also confirmed that his father had died at the property before the Hodgson family had moved in. Maurice asked Terry how his father had died, and Terry confirmed that his father Bill Wilkins had indeed died in his chair downstairs and suffered a brain hemorrhage. Not long after, Janet was taken into hospital for 2 months and a number of psychiatric tests were made on her. In the 2 months Janet was away from the house, the activity started to die down and eventually came to a stop. Janet's mother Peggy stayed in the house until her death in 2003, and the children all moved away to try and build a normal life elsewhere. Many years have passed since the haunting of 284 Green Street in Enfield, but in all that time that has passed, up until the present day, no one has ever changed their story of what occurred in the Hodgson home, including Maurice Gross, who went to his grave a believer. So what do you think? Was 284 Green Street in Enfield really a haunted house? Or was it just mischievous children playing a prank that got a little bit out of control? 30 East Drive is the address of a rundown ex-council house which is said to be the most haunted house in all of the UK, and it sits inside a housing estate on the outskirts of Pontefract. Pontefract is a historic market town in the metropolitan borough of Wakefield in West Yorkshire, and according to historians, the town itself has a very dark history. The haunting of 30 East Drive first started way back in 1966. Either that, or it is the first time it was ever acknowledged. The house still stands today. In fact, if you're brave enough, you can actually pay to spend the night in the ex-council house in Pontefract. The man who now owns the house is a Mr. Bill Bungay, who just happens to be a film producer. And Bill actually made a movie about the haunting called When the Lights Went Out. I actually purchased the film in preparation for this episode, and I can tell you it is actually a very good movie. It's very creepy and scary. There are elements from this actual story in the film, but it's not necessarily 100% accurate to this story. Of course, for the sake of entertainment, it has been heavily dramatised, but it is still a very good, creepy, scary film, and I urge anyone to seek it out and watch it. So like I said, Bill is a movie producer, and at the time when he was working on this horror film, he was looking for a clever way to promote it. When all of a sudden, Bill had a great idea, a perfect way to promote this movie. He would simply buy the actual house, 30 East Drive. After all, it was empty and for sale, and more importantly, it was very cheap. It was dirt cheap. And so that's exactly what Bill did, and he decided to have a red carpet event at the actual house and show the movie to the media and 2 lucky competition winners. And well, it didn't go too well. The film didn't really take off straight away, although now it is considered a little bit of a cult classic. It didn't really take off straight away, and after the event was all over, Bill was left with a supposed haunted house on his hands. And you may be interested to know that Bill didn't believe the house was actually haunted. He just wanted to make a good horror movie based on a so-called real haunting. You see, Bill was a real skeptic. He didn't necessarily believe in ghosts or haunted houses or the paranormal in general. All that was about to change, because it wouldn't be long before the poltergeist that had been fairly dormant was about to wake up. But before we cover the activity in the house these days, let's first go back to 1966 when the Pritchard family moved into 30 East Drive and the horror began. The Black Monk and Pontefract story starts way back in August of 1966 at 30 East Drive. The Pritchard family consisted of Jean and Joe Pritchard, their son Philip, who was 15 years old at the time, and daughter Diane, who was 12 years. The house is a very modest council house, nothing fancy or spectacular about it. Nothing like your usual haunted manor or grand house you would see in movies. This is simply a 2-bed basic house that are not uncommon in the UK. In fact, that's possibly why the case is so terrifying to many, because it's relatable. It's a normal looking house, the same kind many people live in, so it's easy to imagine this happening to yourself in your own home. Like I said, it was August 1966 and the family had gone away to Devon for a holiday during the bank holidays. But Philip had decided he didn't want to go on holiday and he decided to stay behind, so Jean Pritchard's mother came over to stay and look after Philip and the house. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon and Philip decided to take a book into the garden and read, leaving his grandmother alone in the lounge knitting. As Philip sat outside in the warm sun, his grandmother felt a strange chill in the room, and then as 11:30 AM approached, a strange gust of wind blew through the house, rattling windows and slamming doors. Philip came back into the house to investigate. Philip's grandmother asked if there was a wind getting up outside. Philip said no, it's actually quite calm. So Philip's grandmother shrugged it off and went back to her knitting, whilst Philip went into the kitchen to make them both a drink. 10 minutes later, he returned into the lounge, and he was shocked at what he saw. His grandmother was so busy with knitting that she was totally oblivious to a grey-white powder that she was totally submerged in, like chalk dust or talc powder. Philip brought the powder-like substance to his grandmother's attention, and they both peered up to the ceiling. The first thing they did was obviously trying to make sense of the whole thing. Their initial thought was that the powder was coming from the ceiling because the Pritchards had just recently redecorated. It could have been a sound explanation, but in close examination it would seem the dust actually lay separate from the ceiling. The area near the ceiling was actually clear of this chalky, powdery substance. In fact, Philip recalled that when his grandmother stood, her head reached above the chalk dust that just lingered there in the air. Now at this point they weren't afraid, more like confused as to where it was coming from, so Philip's grandmother called her daughter Marie Kelly, who lived across the road, to come and have a look. When Marie arrived at the house, she was shocked to see this dust-like substance floating in the air. The dust had also settled all over the furniture, and it was also floating in the drinks that Philip had made, and Philip's grandmother had become covered head to toe in this white powdery substance. Now Marie went into the kitchen to grab a cloth to start cleaning when she slipped on the lino floor, where a puddle of water had formed. But here's the strange thing about this puddle. Once this puddle was mopped up, it simply reappeared. And then, when it was mopped up once again, it simply reappeared once again, like there was a leak underneath the floor and this water was just coming up. And in fact, that's what they actually thought was happening. They thought that the water was simply coming up through the floor. So they pulled back the lino to find that the floor was bone dry, and yet the water still returned in neat, perfect little circles. Next door to 30 East Drive lived Enid Pritchard, who was married to Joe Pritchard's brother. Enid arrived at the scene after hearing all the commotion and went to find the stopcock underneath the sink. She turned the tap to off and hoped that the flow of water would now stop, but still the puddles kept appearing, and so a plumber was finally called, who, surprise surprise, couldn't find anything wrong. He couldn't find any leaks whatsoever. And eventually, after about an hour, the water stopped appearing and everyone returned to their homes quite confident that the strange occurrences had stopped happening, when in fact it had only just begun. Later that day at around 7 PM, the activity all started up again. As Philip's grandma went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, she noticed that the worktops in the kitchen were covered in tea leaves and sugar, and the button on the tea maker was apparently flicking on and off, on and off, on and off, which made an awful mess all over the draining board. Probably out of pure confusion and desperation to explain what was going on, Philip's grandmother pointed the finger at him, to which Philip responded that it wasn't him. All of a sudden there was an almighty crash that came from the hallway. They both went to investigate, and as they opened the door that led into the dark hallway, the light clicked on all by itself. And then they noticed what made the crashing noise. It was a potted plant that normally sits at the bottom of the stairs, and now it was halfway up the stairs and it had actually left the pot itself. But the pot couldn't be found anywhere. Eventually it was located at the top of the stairs on the landing. Somehow it had managed to travel from the bottom of the stairs all the way to the top. As they stood staring at the pot, a loud vibrating sound came from the kitchen. It was a cupboard which held all the plates and cups. It was shaking violently on the wall. Philip grabbed the door to the cupboard and the shaking suddenly stopped, only to be replaced by another noise coming from elsewhere in the house. It was at this point I think they probably thought enough was enough, and they both fled the house, running across the road to the daughter Marie's house. When they arrived, they explained what had been going on at 30 East Drive, and still after some kind of rational explanation, they all ventured back over to the house to investigate. And when they got there, they found that the cupboard was once again shaking violently on the wall. Now, on the opposite side of the house lived a neighbour named Mrs. Mountain. The Pritchards and Mrs. Mountain shared a wall. So naturally, their first thought was that Mrs. Mountain was doing something on her side of the house, maybe some housework, which was affecting their side of the wall and somehow shaking the cupboard with the plates and cups in. And so they went knocking on Mrs. Manton's door to ask if she was responsible for the strange occurrences that were happening in their house. And to their horror, Mrs. Manton simply said that she actually thought it was a Pritchard making all the noise. When Marie, Philip and his grandmother returned to the house, the activity had stopped. After a while of nothing happening, Marie said she was going back home across the road to go to bed, and if anything else was to happen, they should go and get her immediately. Philip and his grandmother went to bed. They were exhausted, and they were ready for sleep. Now, I was wondering how they could possibly think about going to bed in that house at this stage, and the only explanation I can think of is that they were still trying to find a rational explanation for everything that was happening, and paranormal activity was simply being pushed to the back of the mind, maybe on purpose. As they got settled for the night, Philip's grandmother went into Philip's room to kiss him goodnight before she settled herself. As she went in to kiss him, she noticed that he was staring past her and over her shoulder. His eyes were wide and filled with fear. As she turned, she saw the wardrobe moving and shaking from one side to the other. In the book Poltergeist by Colin Wilson, he described it as a drunken man tottering and swaying from side to side. Philip and his grandmother didn't need any more persuading. They left the house right there and then and went across the road to her daughter's, and there they stayed the night. Once Philip and his grandmother had finally calmed down from the horrifying ordeal they had just gone through, they finally fell asleep in Marie's house. Marie and her husband Vic decided that they needed to investigate further. After all, sleep was not going to happen tonight. They were too curious as to what was happening in the house across the road. Now, one thing I must tell you is that Marie's husband was a rational man. He didn't believe in the paranormal or the supernatural. He believed there was a simple explanation to be found. And that is why Vic picked up the phone and rang the police. It wasn't long before 3 police officers arrived, and accompanied by Marie and Vic, they all entered 30 East Drive. The police initially thought there may be an intruder, and so they searched the house completely, checking for forced entry, looking in wardrobes, cupboards, under the stairs, under the beds, and eventually came to the conclusion that everything was fine, and they returned to the police station. And Vic and Marie returned home. But they were still not ready to give up on this. After all, Marie had also seen some strange things happening in that house, and she wanted answers. And then Marie had a thought. A little way down the street there lived a man named Mr. MacDonald who had an interest in the paranormal and the unexplained. She thought maybe he could help. But the hour was late. It was getting on to midnight at this point, and they wondered whether he would actually be awake or not. So they had a walk down the street, and they discovered that his living room light was still on, so it would seem that he was still up, and so they knocked at his house. Mr. O'Donnell opened the door, looking a little bit confused as to why these people were knocking at this time of night. But when they were given a chance to explain themselves, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, locked up his house, and headed towards 30 East Drive. When they arrived at the house, it was all eerily quiet. And so they simply sat there in the house waiting for some kind of activity. As he sat there in the lounge, Mr. O'Donnell explained the differences between a ghost and a poltergeist. He explained that a poltergeist could be a manifestation of the mind. He believed young Philip was responsible for it, but Philip was across the street now and fast asleep. So they believed nothing much was going to happen that night, and at around 1:30 p.m, they all decided to call it a night. Nothing was happening. As they were getting ready to leave the house, Mr. O'Donnell left with one more bit of information on poltergeists. He told them that poltergeists do strange things like rip up photographs, but without Philip's presence, they agreed that nothing was going to happen tonight. The reasoning behind this, I believe, is that many people believe that poltergeists actually feed off the energy from children who have just gone into puberty, and normally it revolves around girls. You hear a lot of stories about poltergeists like feeding off the energy of young girls. But in this case, Mr. O'Donnell believed that it was actually Philip who was attracting the poltergeist, but as he was not in the house at the moment, they decided to leave. And with that, Mr. O'Donnell said goodnight and headed on home. As Marie and Vic switched off the lights, they were about to lock the door when they heard a massive crash coming from the darkness. They returned back into the house and switched on the lights to the lounge, and on the floor lay 2 small oil paintings that were face down, and glass from the frames lay scattered all around. And then they noticed a picture of Jean and Joe on their wedding day, which had been sliced all the way across it. It would seem that the ghost or the poltergeist had heard exactly what Mr. O'Donnell had said, and it would also seem that it was very much aware of everything. The next day, Philip and his grandmother returned to the house and all was quiet. Eventually, Jean and Joe Pritchard and the young daughter Diana returned home from their holiday, and Philip and his grandmother couldn't wait to tell them everything that had happened while they'd been on their trip. Understandably, Jean and Joe Pritchard didn't exactly believe any of it. They thought it was laughable. But Philip's grandmother, Jean's mother, was desperate for them to understand what had happened and desperate for them to know that it did happen and they weren't going crazy. So she went on to describe in detail what had happened that day when the cold wind blew through the house and the windows and the doors rattled and shook. And then she told Jean of the strange knocking that could be heard from the house. Jean asked what kind of knocks, and as she uttered these words, 3 very loud bangs rang out from somewhere in the house. A cold wind blew through the house, rattling the windows and slamming the doors, and just like that, it was gone. The temperature returned to normal. It would seem that the entity had left, and for the following 2 years, all was well. But eventually, the entity did return, and when it did, it returned with a vengeance. 2 years later, Philip had now left school and went to work in his father's pet shop. Diane was now a teenager, and Mrs. Scholes, the grandmother, was now 72 and spent the weekends with the Pritchards. Mrs. Scholes had never forgotten the strange things that happened 2 years previously, and had recently started to bring it up in conversation. The family didn't appreciate Grandma bringing up these paranormal activity stories. They wanted to forget, but it was obviously bothering Mrs. Scholes. One afternoon, Jean had decided to decorate Diane's bedroom. After a while, she decided it was time for a drink and went downstairs to make a cup of tea for herself and her mother, who was once again talking about the entity. When Jean had finished her drink, she decided to head back upstairs and continue with the decorating, and I can imagine she was getting a little bit fed up of all the talk of ghosts and poltergeists. As Jean approached the bottom of the stairway, she noticed that Diane's counterpane off her bed had somehow made its way downstairs and was lying on the hallway floor. Now, Jean thought this was strange how Diane's bedsheet had left her bed and made its way to the bottom of the stairs, but Jean just shrugged it off and took it back upstairs to Diane's bedroom and proceeded to carry on with the decorating. It wasn't long before she heard a very large crash. She ran out to the landing and peered down the stairs. There was another counterpane bedsheet at the bottom of the stairs. This time, it was Philip's, and it was surrounded by many plant pots that had fallen and spilled soil all over the floor. It would seem that Mrs. Scholes was right. It had returned. Many speculate if it returned because Mrs. Scholes was constantly talking about it. Who knows, maybe it did. Maybe Mrs. Scholes gave it the attention it needed to return. Or maybe Mrs. Scholes simply started talking about it because it had returned and she could feel it. But one thing I can tell you is that Mrs. Scholes did not stay there that night. She went home. That night, as the Pritchards all slept, Jean lay wide awake. It was a very warm night and it was making her restless, so she decided to get up. She hadn't yet finished decorating Diane's bedroom, and all the paint supplies she had removed earlier on that night out onto the landing. As Jean stepped out of her bedroom into the darkness of the landing with only the outside street lamp shining through the window, she noticed a chill in the air. And then she noticed something in the corner of her eye, and as she peered down the dark landing she could see an object floating in mid-air. It was accompanied by a rustling noise. As soon as Jean flicked on the landing light, a paintbrush went flying past her head, followed by a paste bucket, splashing paint all over the place. In shock, Jean stared towards the rustling noise, and it was a roll of wallpaper that had somehow been manipulated into the shape of a snake, as it swayed back and forth as if it was getting ready to strike. Jean made a grab at the paper, and whatever power was manipulating it dispersed, and it rolled out onto the floor. As soon as this happened, a carpet sweeper flew up into the air, spinning around in a crazy spiral. Jean dropped to her hands and knees and crawled back to her bedroom, a roll of wallpaper smashing against the door as she entered the room. Jean finally found her voice and screamed, waking Joe and the kids, who came running onto the landing to see what was going on. Paintbrushes once again started to fly through the air at an incredible speed and managed to strike Diane on the shoulder. But incredibly, she would later say despite the speed it was travelling, it didn't hurt her at all. All the activity on the landing abruptly stopped and restarted in Diane's bedroom. Philip had a clear view into the room and witnessed a wooden pelmet that was screwed in above Diane's window break away, tearing the screws from the wall, and then flew out of the window and fell outside the house. I'm assuming the window was left open that night due to how warm it was. Joe ran to Diane's door and slammed it shut, and as he did so, total chaos broke loose inside the room. From the other side of the door, it sounded as if every object in Diane's room was being thrown around in complete anger. For some reason, maybe a moment of madness, Diane decided to reach out for her doorknob and try to open the door. Her father shouted, "Don't touch it," and as though the entity was responding to Joe, it sent a tremendous thump to the bedroom door that shook the door frame. That night, the entire Pritchard family slept in Joe and Jean's room with the door locked, but to be honest, it probably wouldn't have helped. Now at this part of the story, I should probably say that up until this happening, Joe didn't actually believe in the poltergeist. Everyone else kind of bought Philip and Mrs. Skoll's story, but Joe was a bit of a skeptic and he thought they were all just being a little bit silly, and he didn't really believe in the poltergeist. But if there was one thing that changed his mind, it was that night and another incident that happened to him. Apparently one day Joe had ventured into the coal shed. Now apparently when he was inside the shed, he got the sense that there was a horrible feeling, like a presence that joined him, and the door to the coal shed locked and he was unable to get out, and he could feel this presence with him in the dark. It's unknown what actually happened in the shed with Joe. He never really spoke of it. However, this and the events that happened on that night did change his mind about the poltergeist from that point on. And it was from that day on that activity in the house started to pick up a lot. Don't get me wrong, there were days when nothing happened at all, but then there were days when it would just go crazy. And here's a good example. One day Jean had a friend over and they were stood in the hallway chatting when they noticed something strange coming from the top of the landing. You see, at the top of the stairs stood an old grandfather clock, and they noticed that it had begun to sway ever so slightly back and forth, and then, without warning, the grandfather clock comes smashing down the stairs, breaking into pieces when it hit the bottom. It would seem that the poltergeist was doing everything it could in its power to be noticed. And the poltergeist also gave off the impression that it was very much aware of its surroundings, and it was aware of the Pritchards. At times, its attacks were random, and at other times it seemed like it was listening and responding to things the Pritchards had actually said in conversation. Sometimes it seemed it was creating noise purely for attention, like a child. It craved it. Sometimes the knocks seemed to be made in desperation, and Colin Wilson's book did a good job at describing this. In the book, he said that it was like someone knocking on your front door, desperately wanted to come in. And then at other times it simply seemed mischievous, like a practical joker. And so you couldn't blame the Pritchards for starting to feel like their unwanted guest did indeed have a personality all of its own. And although they were still very afraid of the entity, maybe this is one of the reasons they didn't up and leave. In fact, they even named the entity. They named it Mr. Nobody, and later they would rename it Fred. Now, as I mentioned earlier, poltergeist stories seem to revolve around teenagers who are going through puberty, like they feed off the teenagers' energy. If this is true, it would explain why Fred the poltergeist was noticeably quieter during the day when Diane, who was a teenager at the time, was at school. But when night fell, Fred would wake up and start to bang on the walls. He'd bang on the doors, he'd move furniture. He also had a reputation for turning off the house lights at the fuse box under the stairs. One particular night, as the lights went off once again for the umpteenth time, Jean decided to take some sticky tape and actually stick the switch down on the fuse box so that it couldn't be flicked once again. But within half an hour, the lights were off again. Jean went to the switch box to find that the tape, which was holding the switch in position, had simply vanished into thin air. After a while, the Pritchards decided enough was enough, and a Reverend Davy was called to try and exorcise the entity known as Fred. After the church granted permission, Reverend Davy turned up at the house and waited for any sign of a haunting. The Reverend and the Pritchards sat in the living room for an hour and a half, and nothing happened. And so the Reverend was probably getting a little bit frustrated and probably felt that his time was being wasted, and he got up to leave. He decided that there was nothing going on in this house, there was no ghost, there was no poltergeist, the Pritchards were just simply time wasters. Maybe they were just after their 5 minutes of fame. As he got up to leave, the house just seemed to come alive, and there were bangs and loud bumps and thumps coming from all around the house, and then a candlestick fell from the mantelpiece to the floor. The vicar was still not convinced. He suggested this was simply subsidence in the house, nothing more, nothing less. As if the entity was listening, another candlestick floated from the mantelpiece and made its way over to the vicar and just hung there in the air in front of his nose before dropping to the ground. It was at this point that Jean couldn't help but be a little amused, as she asked if he still believed it was simply subsidence. The vicar stood there trying to come to terms with what he had just seen, when all of a sudden there was an enormous crash that came from the other room. As they returned into the room to investigate, they discovered that every single plate and cup from Jean's china cupboard had been scattered all over the floor, and incredibly, not one was broken. The vicar composed himself, took a deep breath, and then offered the following advice: move house. But for some reason, Jean refused to be ran out of her own home. That night, as Diane was making her way upstairs, once again the lights went out, and she stood in the hallway in complete darkness, as Joel Pritchard was looking for a torch. As Diane stood there in the hallway, she noticed a dark shadow form on the wall, and that familiar cold chill made the hairs on her arms stand up. In the hall was a big piece of oak furniture that floated into the air and pinned Diane between it and the stairs. As soon as the lights were on, Jean noticed what had happened, and she called for Joe to help. They both grabbed the oak stand and tried in vain to lift it off Diane, who was now panicking underneath. But here's the thing, it wasn't hurting her, it was just pinning her down, like some unseen force was pushing it down on her. Jean suggested Diane calm down and try to relax. I don't know how, but she managed it, and the entity, or Fred, released her. Jean took Diane to bed, and that is something I'll never understand. How do you simply sleep after something like that has just happened? I mean, maybe the activity was happening that often that they become kind of numb to it, like it was the norm. But still, I don't think I would sleep soundly that night. And funnily enough, Diane didn't. You see, that night Diane got into bed, and Fred continuously flipped her out of bed and threw a mattress on top of her on the floor. This happened a total of 4 times. Eventually the press came round to write stories on the house. 30 East Drive was becoming a bit of an attraction. Would-be ghost hunters were knocking at the door to ask if they could come in and investigate. The Pritchards would wake up in the morning to find that people had actually camped out all night in front of the house in hopes of hearing or seeing something. And miners on their way to work in the pits in the mornings would often report hearing Fred the poltergeist banging and knocking for their attention. And Fred was about to demand a whole lot more attention of the Pritchards. The press and the public were loving it. But inside the house, when those lights went out, it was far from entertainment, and Fred, it would seem, was getting stronger, and it wouldn't be long before he began to manifest his true appearance. One day, as Jean was out and about doing a few errands, she bumped into a friend named Renee Holden, Vic Kelly's sister from across the road. Renee had a bit of a reputation for being a little bit psychic, so Jean invited her to the house to meet Fred, the poltergeist. On Renee's first visit to the house, she discovered that Fred had totally trashed all 3 bedrooms. Inside the room, the bedroom drawers had been pulled out and the contents were thrown everywhere. Jean explained that before she had left the house, she had just tidied the rooms. It was almost as though Fred knew that Jean was house proud, and he took pleasure in messing up the house as Jean went around cleaning up. Apart from the mess, Fred was quiet that day, but the next time Renee visited, he showed her exactly what he was capable of. It was a Saturday evening. Joel Pritchard was out that day. Mrs. Scholes was in bed feeling unwell, and Philip and Diane were watching television. Jean and Renee had just made sandwiches, and joined Philip and Diane in the lounge. They had hardly sat down when the lights went out. A cold chill blew through the room and chaos followed. In the darkness, unidentified objects were flying around the room, and there was a constant knocking on the windows. When Jean had finally managed to flick the lights back on, they could see that cushions and ornaments had been thrown all over the place. This was all normal for Fred, but this time, he did something new. Jean and Renee noticed that the sandwiches were missing. They had gone, totally vanished. But eventually they did find them behind the television set, and upon closer examination they found that a huge bite had been taken out of one of the sandwiches by something with massive teeth. Now Renee was so fascinated with this, I believe she actually kept the sandwich. Now I'm not sure if she intended to preserve it somehow, but within a few days it had actually crumbled to pieces. Renee would witness more and more activity in the house with the Pritchards. On one particular night when Renee was visiting the house, the lights went out once again, and just as before, objects were being thrown all around the room in the darkness. Renee actually commented that she felt as though her hair was crawling with ants. And then, just as the lights came back on, Fred decided to hit a full pelt in the face with a cushion. And like I said before, you got the impression sometimes that Fred was being a little bit mischievous, and I would say that this was definitely one of those times by throwing this cushion into Renee's face. Now, Renee suggested that Fred was soaking up energy wherever he could. Apparently, the children had reoccurring stomach aches. Renee wondered if Fred was drawing energy from the kids' solar plexus. Now, when I read this, I did a little bit of research on the solar plexus and energy coming from that area. I'm not an expert on this, but I think Renee must have believed in chakras and that the stomach held certain energies there. And this is where she believed the poltergeist was drawing the energy from to create all this activity. Now, it is also believed that there was an underwater stream running under the house, as well as a well, which some neighbours have confirmed does exist, and it actually is buried underneath the living room floor. Now, the next part of the story is actually quite amusing. Now, I've mentioned that poltergeists seem to have a personality at times. Well, on this occasion, it showed its humorous side. Now, Joe Pritchard had a sister, and his sister was called Maud, and she had heard an awful lot about this so-called poltergeist that troubled her brother's family. She didn't believe a word of it. She actually accused the children of playing silly games, silly jokes. Annoyed by this, Joe and Jean invited her around to witness the activity for herself. Or actually, I kind of get the impression that she probably invited herself. And so, whilst Maud was visiting, they all sat in the kitchen. Now, once again, the usual set of events went into motion. The lights went out and a chill blew through the room. Maud sat there in the dark, with a red glow of the kitchen fire illuminating her face. As she sat there, she noticed that the fridge door slowly opened with ease, and a jug of milk floated from the fridge up into the air and then floated towards Maud. Once it was above her head, it tilted and drenched her in milk. And on this occasion it was actually Diane who found the light switch, flicked the lights back on to find Maud spluttering and choking on all this milk that had just been tipped over her head. Maud was drenched. She immediately blamed the children. It would seem she was in denial. Maud needed more evidence of this poltergeist. To be honest, if I saw a jug of milk float through the air and tip over my head, I think that would be all the evidence I needed, but apparently Maud needed a little bit more evidence, so she agreed to stay the night. So as Maud settled in for the night, she removed her coat and she removed her hat, but she couldn't find her gloves that she had already removed earlier on that day. As they moved into the lounge, the lights went off once again, and the usual bangs and clattering could be heard in the darkness until the lights eventually came back on. And when they did, everyone noticed that the electric fire which was in the kitchen had been moved. The chairs were all turned upside down, and the contents of the fridge were just scattered everywhere all over the kitchen. Nothing happened for the rest of the evening, until, that is, the family went to bed. Jean, Diane and Maud all slept in the same room that night, probably a little bit shaken by what she'd seen, but still not 100% convinced. Obviously she was in denial, this woman. As Jean settled into bed, the reading lamp rose into the air and simply floated out of the room. Now, as you can imagine, as this lamp was floating through the door, everyone's attention in the room would have been on this lamp, and that is when they all noticed the bulbs from the downstairs fireplace floating in the doorway as the lamp passed by. And then they noticed something horrifying that they had never seen before. A big dark hand appeared at the top of the door and another dark hand at the bottom. And then they noticed that the hands were actually Aunt Maud's fur gloves. The same gloves that went missing earlier that evening. It would seem that Fred was actually wearing the gloves. Terrified by this, Maud screamed, "Get away, you're evil," and threw a boot at the door, and then the gloves momentarily vanished into thin air and then reappeared. One of the gloves seemed to be motioning or beckoning for them to follow it, whilst the other clenched a fist and seemed to shake it in Maud's direction in a threatening manner. Now at this point Maud was absolutely petrified, and she actually turned to religion and she started singing a religious song, "Onwards Christian Soldiers," and hilariously as she started doing this, the gloves actually started to conduct her like a conductor would in front of an orchestra. And I believe the intention was to mock her more than anything else. And I think this is my favourite part of the story, that the gloves were actually conducting her. Whether you believe this is true or false, that is very inventive storytelling nonetheless, whether it's real or not. So after the gloves had finished conducting Maud's singing, they simply vanished into thin air. And it is at this point that Maud turned to Jean and said, "You have the devil in this house." Finally, she was convinced. A few days later, Maud's gloves were found in a cupboard. Jean returned them to Maud, who instantly burned them in the back garden. Maud insisted she would not step foot into the house again, not even for £20,000. As time went on in the house, apparently Fred would become very good at materialising objects in thin air. One day Fred floated an egg into the front room and dropped it on the floor, and then another followed. Jean didn't want any more eggs dropping on the floor, so she ran to the fridge and she took out the egg box, and she noticed that there were 2 eggs missing, but the fridge was shut. Jean found a wooden box and placed the eggs inside and sat on the box for good measure. An egg simply materialised and dropped to the ground right in front of her. And so Jean jumped up off the box, looked inside and confirmed that another egg had indeed vanished. So she sat back down on the box straight away, trapping all the eggs inside. There was no possible way that the eggs could get out of this box, but she witnessed every single one smash on the ground right in front of her. When she once again got up off the box and had a look inside, every single egg had disappeared. It would seem that Fred had found a way of moving objects through other physical objects, or he could simply teleport them from one dimension to the other. So now, with the manifestation of objects, it was all getting a little bit too much for the Pritchards once again. Fred loved to make a mess, as we've already established. He loved to mess up the bedrooms, he was tipping milk all over the floor, now he was smashing eggs. He also liked to spread butter and jam on door handles, and he loved to keep the family awake all night by making bumps and bangs. And let's be honest, a night full of bumps and bangs wasn't actually that bad compared to some of the other nights that the Pritchards had gone through. For example, the night when Fred was throwing the paintbrushes around the landing and the paint supplies. There was the night when it trapped Diane on the stairs underneath the furniture and then went on to toss her out of bed 4 more times that night. Obviously, all these things were starting to wear the family down, so the Pritchards decided to try a different vicar, one who would be willing to perform an exorcism. And so this time round it would be Vic Kelly from across the street who contacted his Catholic priest, Father Hudson. Now, Father Hudson explained that exorcising a poltergeist wasn't always a good idea, as it often makes things even worse. Also, informed Vic that he wouldn't be able to perform the exorcism himself without permission from the church. But there was no reason why Vic couldn't attempt the exorcism. And so Father Hudson gave Vic some holy water and gave him the proper instructions. Later that day, Vic arrived at 30 Years Drive with his holy water in hand. and for some reason Jean was a little bit reluctant at first, but she eventually allowed Vic to give it a go. And so Vic went all the way around the house, sprinkling every single room, ending in the lounge. And when Vic had finished, Jean inquired when they would know if it had worked. Seconds later, there was a massive crash coming from the upstairs. It would seem it hadn't worked. That night the poltergeist would not let the family sleep. There was banging, there was crashing, Diane got pulled out of bed multiple times. Finally, around 5 AM, it all calmed down, but they could sense that Fred was not happy at all. It would seem that he did not appreciate the attempt to get him out of his house. As the sun rose and the day started, Jean allowed Diane to stay home from school that day, due to the lack of sleep she had had the night before. But Fred wasn't going to let her enjoy her day off. As she stood brushing her hair, Fred threw the table drawer into her back, and then, as soon as the drawer hit the floor, a crucifix flew from the mantelpiece and attached itself to Diane's back like glue. She started to panic, and she started to claw at the cross that was on her back. She struggled to get it off, it was just not coming loose. All of a sudden a picture flew off the wall of Jesus and landed on the floor, followed by the cross, which had simply just fallen away from Diane's back. Diane had a nasty red mark on her back for a few days after that, and it was in the shape of the cross. Now, a few days later, on Easter Sunday, Fred had actually painted inverted crosses on the walls in the house in golden paint. Now, there was a tin of gold spray paint, but Jean wasn't sure if that is where it had come from. But if it had been that exact paint that Fred had used, it would have been almost impossible to do it by any human hand. It is said that the gold crosses on the wall were done perfectly, with perfect straight lines, which would have been almost impossible to do with the way that the paint comes spraying out of the can. The only way it could have been done was with stencils. After the failed exorcism, it would seem that Fred was attacking anything to do with Christianity, maybe in response to the exorcism. Maybe this was his way of mocking the exorcism, or maybe it was just his way of telling the Pritchards, I know what you did, don't try it again. But Jean was not going to give up right now. After all, this was her house. It wasn't Fred's house, it was her house, and if anyone was going to leave, it was going to be Fred. Now, Jean attempted to contact the church once again, but once again the church let her down, and Fred just continued being disruptive, and he just carried on playing his little pranks around the house, sometimes mischievous, sometimes terrifying. For instance, on one day he took Mrs. Holden's coat and simply hid it in the coal shed. They couldn't find it for days, and obviously when they did, they presumed it would have been damaged. But apparently it came out of the coal shed without a mark on it. Crazy how that is possible, but apparently it did. It came out of the coal shed with no marks whatsoever on it. On another occasion, a friend named Andy Williams visited, and after a while he noticed that the windscreen wipers on his car had been left on, which was strange considering he had the car keys and the car ignition was off. That night, as Andy left, he noticed the house had a strange glow around it, and funnily enough, one of Jean's neighbours had actually confirmed this. She had actually seen the house glowing from her own living room, and it is said that the glow around the house was almost like the house had its own aura. I suppose you could say almost like the house was alive itself. Another strange element of the story, which I also found in Colin Wilson's book, was that the poltergeist had actually managed to reduce the electricity bills in the house, which, let's face it, isn't that bad of a thing really. Maybe it had something to do with the poltergeist's ability to absorb energy, and maybe it had something to do with the glow around the house. On some days, Diane's contents of her bedroom would be thrown outside by the poltergeist, and neighbours helped Jean pick everything up and take it back into the house. On another occasion, as Jean was cleaning out the flue of the fireplace, she was actually showered in keys that had fallen out of the chimney. Now, these keys were 19 in total. Now, most of the keys she recognised, they'd actually gone missing a while back. But one of the keys that she found, she had no idea where it had come from. It didn't seem to belong in the house. It didn't fit any door, it didn't fit any window. She had no idea what this key unlocked. maybe it unlocked a mystery, but to this day they still don't know the mystery of that key. On another day, the poltergeist decided to bring in a live wasp's nest, which Jean found in her house, and she disturbed it and all the wasps came swarming out and stung her multiple times. And you know, at this point, if it sounds like I'm just splurting out occurrence after occurrence, it's because I am, because that many things actually happened to the Pritchards, that much paranormal activity actually happened. It was like one after the other, and it's hard to put it into story context other than just saying one day this happened, another day this happened, on one day this happened. It was that constant, one after the other, and it was random. There was no pattern. Sometimes there'd be a long pause in between the strange things that went on in the house, and then other times they'd have like a little outburst of activity. And you know, it was always bumps, it was always bangs, it was always manifesting objects, throwing things, pushing, using an invisible force. But as we progress to this next stage in the story, you will see that the poltergeist actually starts to manifest and show itself. Now, the first time that the poltergeist decided to manifest in front of the Pritchards was late one night as the house lay in a dark silence. As Jean and Joe lay in bed, the bedroom door slowly creaked open, very slowly. They both looked up at the doorway to see the faint apparition of a tall, dark figure that wore a hood over its head. Jean flicked the lamp on, and the apparition vanished. And it is also said that sometimes at night they could also hear laboured breathing coming from round the corner, as if it was coming from the hallway, and they were too scared to actually get up and go and investigate. They'd actually just leave it be and just wait for it to stop. Now, the next person to see the poltergeist was actually Mrs. Mountain, the next door neighbour, and she actually saw the poltergeist in her own kitchen, in her own house. Now, Mrs. Mountain stood at her sink when she felt a presence enter the room who she believed to be her nephew, who was trying to scare her. She turned around to catch him, and she was confronted by a tall, dark figure dressed in a black monk's habit. Now, later Mrs. Mountain would say that the monk looked very real, very solid, like a real monk was stood in the kitchen. Now, Mrs. Mountain said as she stood there in front of this very tall, dark, monk-like figure, that she had a very hard time seeing the monk's face. The monk's face always seemed to be hidden in the shadows of the hood. So, as hard as she tried, all she could see was a dark void. There was no face whatsoever. And this often reminds me of the Grim Reaper. How sometimes you see a skull, but most of the times you just see a dark void with no face at all. Very creepy. It was becoming clear that the activity was becoming more intense. The bangs and the bumps were now louder than ever before, and the monk had also started to introduce farm animal noises at night when the lights went out. So can you imagine now, as well as this thing manifesting in your bedroom doorway at night in the darkness in the form of a monk, as well as the laboured breathing coming from around the doorways, now it was incorporating the sounds of animals, and it is said that it was using the sound of pigs. And I'm sure you're aware that pigs do not make the nicest of sounds, especially when they squeal. So I can only imagine what it would have been like in this house at night time, listening to all these different noises, listening to farm animals squeal and grunt and whatever, and then seeing these visions as well of this monk. I can only imagine. And it is also said that Mrs. Holden also saw the monk, but only the bottom half of his robes. So what all this says to me, if this story is to be believed, is that the poltergeist or Fred or whatever you want to call him, he is beginning to become stronger, and he's beginning to find the energy or the power or whatever you want to call it from somewhere to start and manifest. And now you might say that we're coming up to the climax of the Pritchard story, where things got intensely worse, you might say violently worse. So one of the most terrifying encounters happened one day as the lights once again went out, indicating that the monk, or Fred, was going to make himself heard or seen. As Jean looked for the torch, she heard Diane scream. Now, it wasn't completely dark outside and a little bit of light was still coming through the windows, so as Jean went into the hallway to see what Diane was screaming about, she noticed right away that Diane was actually being dragged up the stairs by a cardigan by some force. She was also being choked by an invisible hand. Jean shouted for Philip and they both ran to Diane and grabbed her on the stairs and tried in vain to pull her down, but the entity was too strong. They just simply clung onto her as she was being pulled up the stairs by the cardigan and being choked at the same time. Now, later on, Philip claimed that it was as if the poltergeist was listening. Philip claimed that in his head, he was telling the poltergeist to let go, and it simply did. And when it did this, Jean, Philip and Diane all fell back down the stairs. They quickly ran away from the bottom of the stairs and got the lights back on, and when they did, they noticed that Diane's neck was completely covered in red finger marks. Now, this was as bad as a haunting ever got. It was as violent as it ever got. The story of the Black Monk of Pontefract haunting the Pritchards was now coming to an end. There was a few other strange things that happened, like the floor being drenched in water with huge footprints embedded in the wet carpet, but nothing else really happened of consequence, until one day when Philip and Diane sat in the lounge watching TV. Their gaze fell upon the frosted glass doors that separated the lounge from the kitchen. On the other side of the glass, they saw a tall, dark figure walk past. As Philip bravely opened the frosted glass doors, they saw the black shape of the monk disappearing into the kitchen floor. This would be the last time that the Pritchards would ever see the monk again. Now, it is said that they had hung garlic around the house because they had heard somewhere that it was a deterrent. I've only ever heard that garlic gets rid of vampires, but they always wondered whether this had something to do with it, or whether the monk had simply decided enough was enough and it was time to move on. Or maybe the poltergeist only visits for a couple of years and then lies dormant again for a few more years, as it did the first time round how it appeared, and then it went away for a few years and then it came back. Who knows, but what I can say is at the time it didn't return, and the Pritchards actually made the house a home. They redecorated, they refurnished, and they finally got on with their lives. Around 10 years later, a man named Tom Cunliffe had decided to investigate the area of 30 Years Drive. He was interested in local history and knew of a priory that existed from 1090 until 1539 in the area. He decided to get in touch with Jean, who told him the full story of the haunting. There was one piece of information that Tom was really interested in. Apparently, one of Jean's neighbours had once found a book in the local library which told of a Cluniac monk who had been found guilty of rape and murder by strangulation of a young girl around the time of Henry VIII, not long before the priory would have been destroyed, and apparently the monk hanged for his crimes. Now, after a bit more research, it was found that the land where the Pritchard house stood was once home to a small bridge that was called Priest Bridge, and on the hill where the house was built once stood the gallows, the place of hangings. Tom's theory was that the monk was hanged for his crimes where the house now stands, so the spirit of the monk went on to haunt the house. And due to the way the monk seemed to single out Diane in its more vicious attacks, including strangulation on the stairs, the poltergeist's intent could have been sexual. But all this is only theory. Although the gallows and the bridge probably did exist, there's no proof of a monk being hung for murder. The book Jean's friend mentioned was never found. Although Colin Wilson's book Poltergeist, which I read in preparation for this episode, does mention that he found evidence of a vicar that was hanged, but not for rape or murder. One theory Colin had was that this poltergeist was listening and playing a game and responding to what people were saying in the house. For instance, Mr. O'Donnell mentioned how poltergeists like to destroy photographs, and of course, what was the next thing to happen? Jean's wedding picture was destroyed by the poltergeist. Apparently, just before the grandfather clock was smashed to pieces when it was pushed down the stairs, someone had commented on how they were surprised that it was still working and how they admired it so much. And then, of course, the next thing, it was pushed down the stairs. And then of course we had the incident with the crosses on the walls that were painted upside down, and then there was the cross that stuck to Diane's back, and then the pictures of Jesus falling to the floor. All this happened after Vic had tried to bless the house with holy water, so maybe this was a response from Fred saying, "You're not going to get me out with faith. This is what I think of faith." And then there is a possibility that maybe someone mentioned that they thought they saw the apparition of a monk, and so Fred, the poltergeist, takes on the appearance of a monk. Or maybe it was actually more than one entity in the house. One thing that Colin Wilson did mention before he finished his story was that Diane had mentioned something to him once that she had not included in the main story because, at the time, she believed she was simply dreaming. Diane told Colin that when she was 6 years old, she came out of her bedroom one day to see an old lady dressed in grey standing outside of her mother's bedroom door, the same bedroom door where the monk would be seen many years later. Now at this time, Jean presumed that Diane was dreaming and thought no more of it. You see, the thing is, at this point in time, the hauntings hadn't started yet. They weren't aware that they were living in a haunted house. So the grey lady stood at Jean's door could have well have been a dream, but there is that slight possibility that it could have also been a ghost. As time went by, Diane and Philip eventually grew older and moved out of the house. On the 21st of June 1986, Joe had a heart attack and died on the bathroom floor in the house. And Jean continued to live in the house for the next 25 years or so with her pet parrot. And it is said that Jean never felt truly alone in that house. And so the Pritchard horror story finally comes to an end, but fast forward to the present day, and it would seem that the Black Monk has indeed made a return. And so now our story has come back to where we started at the beginning of episode 1. Like I said, there was a movie made inspired by the poltergeist case. Mr. Pat Holden was the director of the movie when the lights went out. Pat had grew up with the stories that had happened at 30 East Drive. You see, Pat's mother actually knew Jean, and she was a believer in the poltergeist case. So Pat had been around it for most of his life, and as he grew up, he eventually became interested in film and making movies, and he had decided that he wanted to make a movie on this poltergeist case on 30 East Drive, and that is exactly what he did. And so when they got around to actually making the movie, they didn't film in the actual house at 30 East Drive. You see, they didn't want to bother Jean, who at this time would have been an old lady now. And so they recreated the house interior in a film studio. And once the movie had wrapped, the producer Bill Bungay started to look for imaginative ways to promote the movie. And Bill actually discovered that 30 East Drive was actually empty and had been for sale for almost 4 years. Jean was probably getting to the point in life where she couldn't look after herself, and she had gone to live in a retirement home. Now, it would seem that no one was willing to purchase 30 East Drive, probably due to its legacy, its history. Not many people want to live in a haunted house. And so, because of this, the house was cheap. It was very cheap. And Bill had a crazy idea to purchase a house and have the movie's premiere inside, and 2 lucky competition winners would be invited to the screening, which would be held in the front room of 30 East Drive. And that is exactly what happened. Now, I think I mentioned at the beginning of episode 1, I've actually seen this movie. I bought it on Blu-ray in preparation for this episode, and once the film had finished, which was very good, may I add, it was a really good film. Once the film had finished, I went over to the Blu-ray special features like I always do, and they actually had footage of this premiere night, showing the 2 competition winners being interviewed at the front door and then going into the house and watching the actual film in the living room. And so the 2 lucky competition winners were 2 men named Paul and Chris, and they won and they got to watch the movie, like I said, in the front room where the Black Monk terrorised the Pritchards all those years ago. The men were interviewed as they walked down the red carpet, and then they were interviewed after the movie. They loved the movie, but unfortunately they didn't witness anything paranormal that night. They were given a box of holy water, a Bible and garlic and crucifixes as they entered, and it was all treated as a little bit of fun. And just like that, the main promotion for the movie was over and Bill was left with a house on his hands. And if he was being 100% honest with himself, he didn't really believe that the house was haunted. That is until Bill met Carol, the next door neighbour, who warned him that the monk was still here and wasn't happy. Apparently, Carol was sensitive to spirits and could communicate with the monk on some level. She explained the monk was still active and he could be heard at night making banging noises, and from time to time he would venture into her house, which was Mrs. Mountain's house at the time all those years back. And if you remember, Mrs. Mountain actually saw the monk in her own kitchen, so it would make sense that if this poltergeist is still active, it would still travel from house to house. Now, even though Carol had told him all this, Bill politely made it known that he didn't believe in any of this nonsense. That is until he started to experience paranormal activity himself in 30 East Drive. And here are a few examples that I have found whilst researching this case. During the promotion of the movie, he handed his phone over to a lady named Lisa to take a photo of himself and the cast members. And at this point, his phone was 75% charged. And as soon as she tried to take the picture, the phone just died. The battery drained straight away. The picture, it would seem, hadn't been taken. But a few weeks later, it popped up on his phone, out of nowhere, and he couldn't explain this. And I must admit, whenever you watch these paranormal investigations take place on these TV shows that are a dime a dozen at the moment, how many times have you seen some of their electrical equipment, mainly like the cameras, drain straight away, even though they had a full battery? So I found this piece of information interesting. On another occasion, Bill allowed a mini documentary to take place funded by Bing, the search engine, and the crew had some stories to tell once filming was over. Apparently, not a lot happened during the filming, but when the cameras stopped, the activity started. Apparently, the kettle started switching on and off all by itself over and over again. This sounds very, very familiar to what actually happened to the Pritchards on the first day of the haunting. In between filming for the documentary, the crew actually spent the night at the house. They found it easier rather than travelling to and fro, so they actually just spent the night there. One of the crew members awoke in the middle of the night after feeling like they were being held down against their will. And this also mirrors what happened to Diane when the Pritchards were being haunted. She was constantly being held down by things. Okay, it wasn't directly from the entity, but there were times when she was being held down by a big piece of furniture or a mattress. On another occasion, one of the crew members had lost a big bundle of keys, and we already know that the poltergeist had a bit of an obsession over keys. After all, Jean found quite a lot of keys up the chimney when the activity was at its peak. But there's nothing strange about losing your keys, right? Well, actually, they were found in a very strange place. You see, the keys were found inside a 1970s era vacuum cleaner that Bill had bought as a prop for the house to make it feel like you had stepped into the 1970s. Now, if I'm picturing what this vacuum cleaner would have looked like, I believe my mother would have had one when I was little. I believe it would have been an upright vacuum cleaner and the bag would have held down the side of the handle. It would have been like in between the handle and the base of the hoover, and that is where all the dirt would have been sucked into. And that is where they actually found the keys. And like I said, this vacuum cleaner was purely a prop. Apparently, it didn't actually work. You could not make it pick things up. It didn't turn on. So how could it have possibly sucked up these keys that they found inside the bag? Over time, Bill allowed people into the house to investigate, including friends and actual paranormal investigators. And with the more people who went into the house, the more reports he got of paranormal activity. And slowly, Bill was starting to believe as descriptions of the activity poured in. There were constant bumps and bangs. Shadows of a man were seen that walked through walls. Objects flew through the air, like marbles and pennies that seemed to manifest from nowhere. Another ability that the monk liked to exploit. Also, people reported that they felt they were being touched in the house by an unseen hand. Some people suffered night terrors in the house when sleeping over, and the TV had been known to power on from time to time, despite being unplugged. Bill invited hardened skeptics to the house in an attempt to convince himself, more than others, that all this was just examples of an overactive imagination. But when the skeptics left the house, they often left doubting their own mind, and they were very badly shaken up. Now, at the time of recording this episode, Bill actually still owns a house at 30 East Drive, and for a price you can actually pay to spend the night there. You can make a booking at www.30eastdrive.com, and I must say this website is worth a visit. Even if you're not making a booking, you can read actual testimonies of people who have stayed there, who have submitted their stories to the website, and it is quite interesting. But if you were to make a booking, you would be greeted by Carol, the next door neighbour who lives where Mrs. Mountain lived at the time. She will greet the guests, and she gives them the tour with a few creepy stories before leaving them alone for the night in the house. Carol also looks after the cleaning and the upkeep of the house, and she has many, many stories to tell. The house is constantly visited by amateur paranormal investigators and professional investigators. YouTubers and TV shows have all either reported not seeing much at all or seeing an extremely high amount of paranormal activity, and I simply can't cover everything. This episode would literally go on forever and most likely become very repetitive. If you want to read more on the Black Monk of Pontefract, I can recommend two books that I used as sources. Like I said before, Colin Wilson's Poltergeist, A Study in Destructive Haunting, is probably one of the best books you can read on this case. And then we have Richard S. Stepp and Bill Bungay's The Black Monk of Pontefract, the world's most violent and relentless poltergeist. Both books are packed with information, and I mean that they are absolutely packed. They are both really good reads. In fact, if you've got Amazon Prime, I believe you can read the second book absolutely free on your Kindle. That's how I actually read the second book, and I must admit there are elements to this book which are really interesting. They actually mention that the previous owners who lived in the house before the Pritchards actually reported some strange things happening in the house, more like feelings in the house, like dark, depressive feelings, and it actually prompted them to do a house swap with the Pritchards, and that is how it actually all come about, that the Pritchards lived in this house. It was actually due to a house swap, and then the haunting wouldn't take place for quite some time later. But apparently, according to this book, there was a family who lived in the house beforehand who felt that there was something negative in this house and they couldn't call it a home, and so they arranged the house swap. But it is interesting to mention that there are many other houses in the same area in Pontefract that many people claim are haunted, and it has actually led many to believe that it's not actually the houses that are haunted, it could actually be the land that is haunted. So what do you think? Is the Black Monk of Pontefract just some sensational hoax that has been reignited to make money in the modern day? Or is it possible that the evil spirit of a murderous monk drifts from room to room at 30 East Drive when the lights go out? As always, I'll let you decide. Today on Bizarre Podcast, I'm going to be telling you about a very famous haunting which took place in the UK in 1956 in the very small family home of the Hitchings at 63 Wycliffe Road in Battersea in southwest London. And it took the UK by storm and for a while forced a 15-year-old girl into the eye of the national newspapers. And the strange story of the haunting even reached Parliament. This 15-year-old girl was named Shirley Hitchings, who lived with her father Wally, an underground train driver, and mother Kitty, who was wheelchair-bound, and her grandmother Ethel, and her adopted son John. The house was a two-storey structure which was actually being used as two homes, so to speak. The downstairs was home to Shirley and her mother and father Wally and Kitty, whilst upstairs was home to Ethel and John. The family literally lived on top of each other in their small, contained, but happy little home. But the quiet, calm, happy little home wouldn't last for long, for on the 27th of January 1956, the haunting began. 27th of January 1956. It all started with an ornate, solitary key that seemed to appear out of thin air and manifest of the pillow which sat upon the bed of 15-year-old Shirley Hitchings. As Shirley reached out and took hold of the key, which was around 4 inches in length and silver, she wondered where it had come from, and who had placed it upon her pillow with such purpose. It didn't look like it had been misplaced. It looked as though it had been placed upon the pillow with intent. Shirley at once brought the key to her father, who had no idea what this small silver key unlocked. He at once went around the house and proceeded to try the key in multiple locks, but it either didn't fit or unlock anything in the old Victorian house. That very night, the family experienced strange knocking noises coming from around the house, from within the walls, and sometimes it seemed like it was coming from within the ground, an eerie tapping and knocking that just wouldn't give in. It persisted all through the night, and it only got louder and louder all around the house, so loud in fact that the neighbours started to come knocking on the door, a little upset that they had been awoken at such a late hour. Even the police made an appearance, but unable to find a reason for the sounds, the present was simply pointless. Shirley clung to her father, begging him to make the noises stop. But what could he do? He had no control over the situation, and the noises went on until the early hours of the morning. Over the next couple of days, the noises seemed to become more and more frequent, but there was a pattern developing. Most of the time, the strange noises seemed to start up whenever Shirley would enter the room. It was like the noises followed her around. Well, actually, they did. Shirley started to notice the tapping and the knocking and the scratching would be ever present wherever she may go, whether that be taking a bus ride or even at her place of work, where she worked as a seamstress. And on a few occasions, she was accused of making the noises herself, and was even blamed for the disappearance of a few pairs of scissors, and was eventually fired from a place of employment. It is not known for certain if the appearance of the strange key was a sign of the paranormal activity which was to come, but for a while the key seemed to have a mind of its own, sometimes being placed in one place and then reappearing on Shirley's pillow once again, and one day it just simply disappeared, never to be seen again. After reading this, I started to look into the symbolisms of keys, especially in spirituality. First of all, the most obvious symbolism of a key is when you give someone the key to your heart in a romantic gesture. A key can also symbolize comfort. For example, a key can lock you into your home at night, literally locking out the outside world and possible intruders, giving you peace of mind that you are safe as you sleep. But just as a key can make you feel safe and secure, a key can also make you feel trapped and confined to be locked inside a room against your will. But just like a key can keep you locked up, it can also give you freedom. But I think the most fitting symbolism for a key for today's story is the following. Some believe that a key can symbolize the opening of a door, a spiritual door that stands between the living and the dead. 18th of February 1956. The strange bumps, bangs, knocking and tapping went on, but up until this point nothing had actually moved, unless you count the strange key that liked to mysteriously appear on Shirley's pillow. That is until one day when Shirley dropped a glove upon the floor. As she bent down to grab the glove, it flew up into the air of its own accord with some force and slapped Wally, her father, in the face. And a pair of slippers flew up from the floor and found themselves upon a table. The very same pair that would later go for a walk around the house as if some invisible phantom was wearing them upon his feet. They made their way into the hall, followed by a scared but fascinated Shirley, before they stopped dead in their tracks. And it certainly did shake up the family, and nothing could prepare them for the night ahead of them. The back room of the house was what they used as their front room, their living room, where they had a large TV. Well, large for 1956, when a TV set was a luxury, a definite step up from the radio, but make no mistake, money did not come easy to the family, and the house was definitely small and cramped. And as close as they sat to the TV, some nights they struggled to hear the programme over the knocking and scratching noises that seemed to come from all around. In the actual front room of the house, Shirley shared a room with her parents. Her small bed was placed next to her mother and father's. This was due to Shirley sleepwalking, and so they all slept in one room with the door locked at night. That night the family were finding it very hard to sleep, as all the tapping continued to come from the floor, the walls, and even the bed that Shirley lay upon. As Shirley lay there in the darkness trying in vain to fall asleep, she noticed that her bed sheets were being pulled from her bed. She tried to pull them back, but they continued to be pulled the opposite way. Her mother and father asked that she raise her arms so they could be sure Shirley was not somehow moving the bed sheets, and it was clear she wasn't, especially when her whole body went rigid and arched like a bow, and she seemed to levitate at least 6 inches above the mattress. Her shocked father grabbed her and took her from the bed and placed her upon the ground, as a sheet flew from Shirley's bed onto her parents, and Shirley collapsed onto the floor. Over the next couple of days, the paranormal activity continued, and the knocking became so loud that the neighbours thought that they would do a little knocking of their own, as they came knocking upon the door of the family to complain.
20th of February
1956. The activity had now gone from some eerie bumps and bangs to actual levitation of objects that would float into the air and fly off at incredible speeds, normally towards somebody or at a wall. At this point, most people knew about the strange goings-on inside the house, including the neighbours and the landlord, and it wasn't long before the national newspapers heard about the terrifying poltergeist that the family had affectionately named Charlie Boy or Spooky Willie. And the newspapers came away with the sensational stories of chairs being knocked over by unforeseen forces, clocks flying from the mantelpiece, and of course the slippers that like to fly or walk around the house. One of the reporters suggested asking Spooky Willie some simple questions. The poltergeist could answer with 1 tap for yes, 2 for no, and 3 for I don't know. The reporter asked, "Are you evil?" The response was, "No." The reporter then asked, "Can we help you in any way?" The response was, "Yes." The reporter then asked, "Have you a message for Shirley?" The response was, "Yes." The reporter then asked, "Will you deliver it today?" The response was, "No." The reporter then asked, "Tomorrow?" The response was, "No." The reporter then asked, "On Sunday?" And the response was, "Yes." The reporter then went on to ask, how old was Shirley? "15 knocks. Shirley was 15 years of age." Now this is where the story gets a little bit muddled. Through more questioning, it was discovered that the spirit was Shirley's dead grandmother. And then the story changed, and now the spirit was that of a young boy who played with Shirley a few years back when Shirley was younger, and the little boy was named Donald. The reporter came to the conclusion through the knocks that once a young boy had moved away overseas, he had died on the journey. This once again turned out to be false. There was indeed a little boy who used to live next door called Donald who Shirley played with, but the little boy moved away from the area with his parents overseas. And it didn't take long to confirm that the boy was indeed alive and well. But from this day, the poltergeist would be known as Donald regardless, and the names Spooky Willie and Charlie Boy faded into obscurity. Although it's worth mentioning, Shirley claims that the name given to the poltergeist didn't come from the childhood friend, but a very fiery, feisty, angry duck named Donald Duck. Regardless, from this point on, the poltergeist would be called Donald. The reporter was also responsible for creating a fabricated love story between Donald and Shirley, which you might say is downright cruel, but of course Shirley claims that this was never the case and it was all imaginative storytelling by the newspapers. At some point, Ethel, Shirley's grandmother, was also interviewed. The thing we need to remember about Ethel is that she was a stern, strong-headed Irish woman who didn't think it was wise to communicate with the spirit. She did, however, claim to have seen strange things whilst working as a nurse. This including witnessing the souls of the patients leave their body behind, and the ghost of her dead husband that visited her after his death and stood eerily at the bottom of her bed. As well as the newspapers, a self-claimed medium named Harry Hanks, a friend of Wally's from work, arrived to help in any way he could, by trying to make contact through his spiritual gift. Wally was reluctant at first, but quickly warmed to the idea after the activity started to get worse. Apart from a few knockings here and there, in response to questions, very little was established about the activity. Donald remained a mystery. 21st of February, 1956. It wasn't only the newspapers who wanted Shirley's story. The BBC wanted to get in on the story as well, and an interview was arranged to take place that very day at the BBC studios. Shirley must have been exhausted due to the activity carrying on through the night, just as Donald promised. You see, Shirley had asked Donald earlier before bed if he planned to behave himself tonight and let them rest, and he responded with 3 sets of 2 knocks, which meant no, 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 and he was as good as his word. Throughout the night, the knocks got louder and louder. Shirley's glove would once again find itself flying across the room, and the bedsheets would be tugged away from underneath her body. Apparently, Donald also liked to lie upon the bed, across her legs. Sleep simply wasn't going to be an option. Even Shirley's grandmother did not escape the disturbances as a chair in Ethel's bedroom overturned in the dead of night. Despite all this, Shirley did make it to the BBC studios to appear on a TV show named Highlight. Shirley had her interview in front of the bright lights of the studio and told her terrifying story, but unfortunately Donald refused to put on a show and was unusually quiet compared to normal. By now, the story of the poltergeist at 63 Wycliffe Road had become a national sensation. It wasn't only the newspapers that wanted to get the story about Donald, but the general public, who wanted to experience the haunting for themselves, even going as far as jumping the wall into the back garden of the Hitchings. The family started to feel very claustrophobic and angry by all the attention, and they desperately wanted Donald to be gone. The family friend Harry Hanks returned on the scene with hopes of communicating with the spirit. Now, at this point in history, spiritualism was quite big. The Ouija board had been on the market since the late 1800s and was seen as an effective but not recommended way to contact the dead, and Wally and Kitty were dead against the use of a Ouija board in their home. So Harry Hanks decided to simply write out letters of the alphabet, and using the knocking system, Donald would actually spell out words in response to the questions given to him. Although it must be said, Donald was not the best when it came to spelling, but the messages, 9 times out of 10, seemed to make sense. 22nd of February, 1956. Harry Hanks was making some progress, but he insisted that the next step was to hold a séance at his home in Stockwell, and attempt to rid Shirley of Donald the Poltergeist once and for all, to exorcise the disruptive spirit. Shirley's parents were not keen on the idea, but Hanks was very persuasive, and the press also supported the idea, but I imagine it was just to sell newspapers, and I don't actually think Harry Hanks had Shirley's best interests at heart, as it was himself who invited the press. I'm thinking he saw an opportunity and manipulated the affair slightly. The séance took place in Harry's front room. The lights shut out and a circle formed around Shirley. Crammed like sardines into the front room was Hanks, his wife and his daughter, who was in her 20s, Wally, and a clairvoyant and a spiritualist, as well as photographers and reporters. Hanks quickly put himself into a trance, and his face seemed to change, and he attempted to make contact. However, all of a sudden, there was a loud banging at the door. Bang, bang, bang. Now, I can imagine it must have made a few people jump, but this wasn't the banging of an angry poltergeist banging on the walls. No, this was the sound of the police banging on the front door. Someone had tipped off the police that a black magic ritual was underway in the home of Harry Hanks. The police entered and was eventually convinced that the séance was breaking no law and was by no means black magic, and eventually they left. Hanks continued the exorcism, shaking and trembling and using a booming voice that he claimed was the voice of his spirit guide. He proclaimed aloud that Donald was now gone. The exorcism was successful, and there was a certain calm after the séance, and it did indeed seem that Donald had indeed gone for good. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The haunting was about to get a lot worse. The very next day, 2 reporters arrived, and they claimed that Shirley's brother John gave them permission to take Shirley to a doctor and to answer some questions, but John most definitely did not give permission. He knew nothing about it. But to make Shirley feel more at ease, they gave her sweets and fizzy pop to gain her trust. Shirley was fooled by the reporters, and she went along with them anyway, in what I class an extremely disturbing thing to do with a young teen. To manipulate her like that is disgusting. Whilst with the reporter, Shirley was asked many questions, and they actually experienced some strange tapping and knocking that seemed to be coming from Shirley herself. But they were not convinced it was anything supernatural. One of the reporters claimed that the sounds seemed to be coming from Shirley's feet, and when they asked her to remove her boot, the tapping stopped at once. Upon further inspection, it seemed that Shirley had a mild deformity of her big toe. This deformity is called hammer toe, a condition where normally the second or third toe can bend or curl downwards due to the middle joint becoming more flexible. It was a reporter's opinion that Shirley could actually make her toe produce a loud clicking, cracking noise that they believed was a tapping and rapping that was supposedly coming from the poltergeist. Of course, at the time of the interview, Shirley had no idea why they wanted her to remove her boot, and when they asked her to pose for photographs holding the boot up, she simply did so. She was tired and hungry and simply wanted to go home. Shirley claims that when she eventually did arrive home, the activity started back up with a vengeance. First of all, the house seemed to come alive with the sounds of knocks, bumps and bangs, and at around 11 PM that night, objects started to be thrown around the house, such as a photo frame and slippers. Some of the objects were even launched at Ethel, Shirley's grandmother. This paranormal activity was followed up by a small fire that started in the front bedroom, setting the bed sheets alight, but luckily it was quickly put out. On another occasion, Shirley's watch fell from her wrist. She picked it up and fastened the strap to find moments later it had simply disappeared. It was clear to the family it was a poltergeist who had took the watch, and so Shirley's father called out for Donald to return it at once. It wasn't long before pieces of the watch started to fall at his feet, but not all the pieces of the watch. Shirley's father then threatens to call the police. This bit actually did make me laugh, the fact that Shirley's father was threatening a poltergeist with the police, and the poltergeist actually responds by returning the watch, even if it is in pieces. You see, the poltergeist returned more pieces of the watch, and he dropped them at Wally's feet. But the metal surround and strap were still missing, so Wally makes one more threat, and then the rest of the watch appears, although the metal surround was said to be bent. A few days later, a story appeared in the Weekend Mail, and the headline was the following: "Spook was in girl's big toe." The article was written in such a way to suggest that the haunting was a big hoax, and the tapping noises that were supposed to be coming from Donald the Poltergeist were actually coming from Shirley's big toe, whether she was aware of it or not. The paper said she may have been doing it subconsciously. The article also said that Shirley's mind was filled with horrific stories that she had become fascinated with, like certain TV shows and her grandmother's ghost stories of a dead husband at the bottom of her bed. And Shirley had taken all of this in and had convinced herself of the haunting and subconsciously made the clicking, cracking noises with a hammer-toe deformity, which was only possible when she wore her boots. To this day, Shirley insists that it is ridiculous that this story was written and that the reporters actually witnessed Donald throwing piles of papers from the desk, and yet it was never mentioned in the article. Shirley was now seen as a liar in the public eye and shamed in front of the nation. Who would want to help the family now rid them of Donald the Poltergeist, now that Shirley had been made out to be a liar? Well, there was one man who desperately wanted to help the family. He wanted nothing in return for his services. After all, being a paranormal researcher wasn't his full-time job. He actually worked down at the tax office. So the paranormal research side was more of a hobby. He had a genuine fascination with the paranormal and had become fascinated with this particular case. And on the 6th of March 1956, he arrived on the doorstep of 63 Wycliffe Road, raised a hand and knocked upon the door. And when the door swung open, he introduced himself as Mr. Harold Chibbett. Harold Chibbett was born on February the 19th, 1900 in Islington, North London. He was a very curious man who had a fascination with all things paranormal and also liked a touch of science fiction, quite fitting as the two I think actually go hand in hand. He was a very imaginative man and put his talents to use by writing many science fiction stories when he became a member of the London Science Fiction Club. Harold loved investigating strange paranormal activity, and his investigations made it possible for him to interview people such as the occultist Aleister Crowley and other people who all shared his passion or indeed harnessed a special gift. He even became the founder of The Probe, which was a British group of investigators of psychic and occult phenomena. And the case of the strange poltergeist named Donald that had thrown the Hitchings family into their very own horror movie was a case that interested him very much. But Harold wasn't after fame and fortune. He wasn't after the attention of the press. His interest was genuine. If anything, all Harold wanted was the truth. And if he ever had the opportunity to debunk something, he would. The truth was always more important to him. At first, the Hitchings were a bit apprehensive. After all, they had people knocking day and night, claiming that they can help, claiming that they can talk to spirits. Harold Chibbett made no such claim. His intent was to investigate and try to make contact. He gave no guarantee that he could, but he did have a lot of experience in the matter, and this eased the family into trusting Harold. His investigation, of course, would have to be from the start of the haunting, and there was so much he had missed out on. After all, the tabloids were hardly the best source for information. He needed to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and so the family invited him into the kitchen, where they sat around the table, and he listened intently as the family retold the story that started with a solitary key. He was a little late to the party, and he had already missed so much. 8th of March, 1956. Over the last few days, the activity was ongoing. Shirley awoke one morning to find her watch was completely crushed on her bedside table. A clock and 2 photos were found on a mat in front of the fire in the kitchen, and a ball was witnessed flying through the air thrown by an invisible force. And of course, the tapping and knocking was ever present, along with strange scratching sounds. But it was on the 8th of March that Donald started to request a one-man audience from a reporter that had actually visited in the past, a reporter named Michael Kirch. The messages from the poltergeist were tapped out and made into words, and said the following: "Get Kirch. I like to get Kirch on his own. I teach him a lesson. I poke him. I come with message later. I get revenge on Kirch. Suffocate him tonight. Save him if you like. I warn you, get him tonight for safety." There was a few days of relentless activity, such as a levitating fire poker, the bed shaking, the reappearance of a missing gold cross on a chain, and the disappearance of Shirley's favourite pen. And Donald's tapping evolved into tapping out a tune for the family to sing along to. Donald started requesting another reporter's presence by the name of Ronald Maxwell. The family took down persistent tapped-out messages throughout the night. "Get Maxwell, Kirch is no good. I will set house afire if you don't get Maxwell, so take care." This was followed by 3 strange balls of light that floated through the air in front of the family. Later on that night, the head of a match was struck by Donald, and the match slowly floated through the air towards Shirley. When it reached her, it fell to the ground and slightly burned her eyebrows on the way down. In the early hours, another message was tapped out. "Get Maxwell. I just give you taste of what I am going to do, so get Maxwell. I warn you, no one will stop me." It's at this point in the story when the activity seemed to turn quite nasty, when the family found that their bed sheets on the front room bed had burst into flames. Shirley's father Wally suffered a large gash and a nasty burn whilst trying to put out the fire. It's believed that the cut on Wally's arm could have been made by the poltergeist, but we cannot be sure of this. Over the next couple of nights, Shirley goes to stay at her Aunt Nell's house to have a break from the whole nightmare, but as we have established, wherever Shirley goes, Donald would follow. The first night at Aunt Nell's was quite calm, apart from a few knocking and tapping here and there. The day after, Shirley initially returned to her home at number 63, but by request of Donald she returned to Aunt Nell's, and that night Donald was more active, tapping out messages for Aunt Nell to take down. Donald tells Aunt Nell to not fear him, he is here to guard them. That night Aunt Nell did not sleep well. Her bedsheets were pulled from the bed and objects were thrown all around the room. The very next day, to Aunt Nell's relief I'm sure, Shirley returned home. 17th of March 1956. Joyce Lewis was a reporter for the South London Advertiser, and she was invited to stay the night in Shirley's bed and experience the paranormal activity for herself, and she brought with her John Heel, another reporter, to stand watch outside of the door. That night, as Joyce and Shirley get ready for bed, Joyce asks if she may restrain Shirley with insulating tape on her hands and feet, to rule out the possibility that Shirley was actually responsible for the paranormal activity. And Shirley agreed, and she was taped up quite securely, and they both settled in for the night. But a good night's sleep was simply not going to happen. As they settled down for bed, all at once there was a terrible scraping noise that came from underneath the bed. It startled Joyce, and Shirley assured her that everything was okay, and this was just the beginning. Just after midnight, the undersheets of the bed started to rise up of their own accord, and as Joyce pulled them back down, they were quickly pulled back with forceful tug by invisible hands. A few minutes later, after Joyce had remade the bed, the scraping sound started up again, but this time it seemed even louder, and it sounded like it was coming from the head of the bed. The next thing they feel is an icy draft that flows above their feet, and the bedsheets are yanked away from the bed. As the hour nears 1 a.m, Joyce is overcome by the sweet smell of violets, that then suddenly changed to a foul smell, not unlike burning rubber. At around 1:20 a.m, Shirley tells Joyce that she has been scratched on her leg. May I remind you at this point that she is taped up, and Joyce was actually holding Shirley's hands and feet with her own. When Joyce examines Shirley's leg, she does indeed see scratch marks. At around 1:30 a.m, Shirley has fallen asleep. Of course, Joyce is still awake, when there is an almighty bang on the bed that scared her half to death. Strangely, Shirley sleeps through this, even when the bed starts to shake and bounce. At 2:05 a.m, Joyce can feel Donald tickling her ankle, and when she objects, the bed sheets are once again pulled from the bed. At 2:30, Joyce notices that Shirley, who was asleep at the time, is being pulled by the arm out of the bed. Joyce grabs onto Shirley and tries in vain to pull her back into the bed. Shirley awakes at this point, half in and half out of the bed. At around 4 a.m, after a few more hours of tapping, scratching and sheet pulling, they decide to have a tea break. At 4:30 a.m, they are back in bed, and it isn't long before Shirley cries out that someone is touching her feet, and it feels like a strange sensation around her big toe. When they take a look, they discover that Donald has tied a piece of string around Shirley's big toe. This makes them laugh. Shortly after, an exhausted Joyce decided that she had had enough, and she left the house with her story. In the article, Joyce Lewis and John Heel, the second reporter who had been there the whole night, outside the room, were quite convinced that there was definitely something very strange going on at number 63. For the next few days, the activity increased and the tapped-out messages became more and more sinister and unsettling, and on occasion the messages would have to be translated from French into English. One of these words were La Manche, which was translated by Chibbet. La Manche translated into channel, as in the English Channel. This will make more sense a little later. A lot of the messages seem to be nonsense and make no sense, such as, "I will do harm to anyone who don't believe in flying saucers," and "I come from the atmosphere." Harold Chibbet was curious if the entity could be something other than a poltergeist, maybe it was alien in nature, so Harold asked about space travel and life on other planets, and Donald was more than happy to respond by telling Harold that there was indeed life on Mars, Saturn and Venus. But space travel wasn't the topic of conversation for long when Donald started to make more threats, such as, "I will set fire to Nan's bed in night, ready for fire, you don't think I do it?" The same night, the family discovered the electric stove had been turned on not once but twice. Even after being unplugged, the switch was still flipped. The next day, more messages came. "You made me angry. I set fire. You can't stop me. You almost die. No escape now. I do not kid. Get out of home for tonight. I set atomic gas off." The next day, pieces of burnt paper are found under Ethel's bed. All of this threatening behaviour went on and on, which included more levitation of objects like a bottle of milk that was thrown at Shirley. Apart from the increase of threats, the activity was nothing new really, but that was all about to change when Donald started to communicate in a brand new way. 22nd of March 1956. It was on this day that Shirley discovered that Donald had actually written her a message by using a blue ballpoint pen and a notebook. The writing was scribbled and was almost unreadable and quite unnerving and downright creepy. The note read, "Shirley, I come, my Shirley." In fact, in the future, Donald would start to write many letters to the family with strange requests and strange information. But Harold Chibbet could not be sure that Shirley wasn't the one writing the letters, so he placed a pen and writing pad in a room and locked the door and left for the night. On his return to number 63 the next day, he would find nearly 60 letters had been written or scribbled by the poltergeist. Harold kept hold of the key all night, so there was no way for anyone from the family to enter the room, unless of course they had a spare key, or somehow got in through a window, but Harold couldn't find any sign anywhere that anyone had entered the room, apart from the letters of course. Even though Donald had started writing letters, he actually did go back to his old method of tapping from time to time. And on one particular occasion, he insisted that Shirley go and sleep at her Aunt Nell's house in peace. Shirley did so, and she got a good night's rest, uninterrupted, the best night's sleep she had had for a while. However, the next day, the threats once again picked up, and once again Donald demanded the presence of a certain reporter, like Maxwell, and when the family decided not to play to the whims of the poltergeist, more threats came. Like Donald threatened to set the house on fire once again, and he also said that he came to destroy the house, and this time he won't fail. Now the following all happened over the coming weeks, and it can get a bit repetitive, so I'll just list some of the things that happened. The next night, Donald demands that Shirley sleep with her grandmother, but Ethel wasn't going to be told what to do by anybody, not even a ghost, and she said sternly that that wasn't going to happen. Donald didn't like this one bit, and via the tapping system, the following threatening, insulting messages were taken down. The first message was Donald threatening that if Shirley did not sleep with her grandmother, then he would not leave the family alone. He then said he would tip Nan out of bed. "Let's go get silly old cow up. Silly old bugger, she is old battle axe." He even insulted her nose, saying it looked like an overgrown beetroot. These rude, insulting messages towards Shirley's grandmother carried on for the next few days. Just like the written letters, Donald also started to be audible, although it was few and far between. On one occasion, Aunt Nell's husband's missing cufflinks reappeared. When Aunt Nell asked Donald if he was responsible for the return of the cufflinks, a faint yes was heard, as though it floated in the air. At this point, Donald was so active that the family had actually started to sleep on the kitchen floor, where they actually felt more safe for some reason. After more communication with Donald, it was established that he wasn't the only entity that liked to visit the family. There was probably 3 to 4 entities, 2 of which were called Mickey and Dopey, and according to Donald, when they made their presence known, Donald had to leave because they used his power. On one occasion, Donald warned the family that Mickey and Dopey were going to start a fire, and then informed them that he would have to leave. Donald returned the next day and told the family that the 2 entities had now left. There was no fire started in the house that night, but on other occasions Donald would threaten to set the house on fire unless this was an entity pretending to be Donald. The activity for the longest time carried on in this manner, threatening to set the house on fire, making a mess by throwing objects, unmaking the beds, ornaments overturned, and bizarre requests that Shirley sleep with her grandmother, and even make contact with her childhood friend Donald, the child Shirley played with, from next door before he moved away overseas. After more threats to start a fire, eventually there was a fire started on the stove in the kitchen. The electricity was actually turned off but was mysteriously turned back on, and old rags were burnt up on the stove. Now this fire did actually cause a small amount of damage to the kitchen, and the family did make a claim on the insurance. On the form, when asked about the cause of the fire, it simply read, poltergeist. The police eventually got involved once again, insisting that Shirley see a psychologist, otherwise she may be taken into care. Shirley was given medication, and she refused to take it. It was seen that Donald also didn't agree with the medication. One day, all the pills that had been subscribed to Shirley were found dissolving in a pudding bowl full of water on the kitchen table, and once again, Shirley insisted it wasn't her doing. Harold Chibbett was now a regular visitor. He would arrive on the scene every week or so to take down all the information of the haunting. Harold Chibbett was a welcomed addition to the case. He brought with him a sense of calm. He believed the only way to get rid of the spirit was to communicate with it and to find out what it wanted. But at the same time, he did consider the possibilities that Shirley or a family member were responsible for the haunting, and did all he could to make sure that he wasn't being made a fool out of. Donald's constant demands for the reporters was a regular part of the haunting now, claiming that if the reporters came, then he would reveal his true identity. Donald also seemed obsessed with arranging a reunion with Shirley and the child Donald who once lived next door, possibly a romantic reunion. And for some reason, Donald sometimes liked to communicate in French, and on occasion Donald had actually claimed that he came from France, and he was born in 1798, and that he had drowned when young. In his own words, when he was 15, possibly meaning 15, and then there's a reference to the English Channel. Was it possible Donald drowned as a child in the English Channel? And Donald also mentioned the French word, and you'll have to excuse me here if I've pronounced this wrong, dolphin, which was French for dolphin, but could also mean, in a nutshell, heir to the throne. From all of this, Harold Chibbett came up with the wild notion that Donald could be some kind of French royalty. The thing is, Donald, or whatever entity was coming through at this particular time, just couldn't be trusted, but they could only go off the messages that were received. Now this may seem like some kind of big breakthrough, and Harold Chibbett certainly did believe that, but bear this in mind, as well as French, the entity also claimed to speak, are you ready? Martian. So as you can imagine, it was hard to establish an identity, but the connection with France was ever present, and it did come across more than once, even going as far as to tapping out the song Frère Jacques, and even describing his appearance in life. He said he was 5 foot high, he had fair hair, blue eyes, and he said he was 34 inches wide. I'm guessing he meant chest size. Eventually, sometime in April, the reporter Kirch returned to the house as Donald requested many times, but frustratingly, Donald refused to communicate. Directly after the visit, the activity started up again, and it was starting to take its toll on Shirley's grandmother, who was tired of the constant visits from the reporters and the public, and the random fires and the flying objects, as well as the constant demands that Shirley sleep in her bed, and almost falling down the stairs after being pushed on many occasions. But there was one incident that probably made Ethel think enough was enough, and that was when she heard the voice of her dead mother speaking to her. Possibly a cruel prank by Donald or whatever entity was communicating that day. She decided to move out of the property and go and live with her other daughter, and you would think that this would have pleased the poltergeist, when in fact Donald demanded that Ethel return. And of course, when she didn't, Donald started to show his anger by tipping paint onto Shirley's leg, throwing items around the house, and threats to set fires started up again, followed by burning embers found on the floor. Donald would later insist that it wasn't him causing the trouble, but it was due to the arrival of a new entity named Old Shaggy Roots, and Donald insisted he was here to protect the family. Sadly, not long after this, Shirley's grandmother had a stroke and passed away in hospital. 15th of May 1956. Harold had been piecing the French connections together and had a wild theory that Donald may have been the first son of Louis XVI. When asked, Donald confirmed that this was true, so Harold came up with the conclusion that the poltergeist, Donald, may well have been Louis XVII, who died whilst imprisoned, and died in 1795, 2 years after his father's execution during the French Revolution. He died at the age of 10. There have been a few conspiracy theories as to if the young prince actually did escape captivity. With this theory in Harold's mind, he came up to the conclusion that Donald may well have been the young heir to the throne and could possibly have drowned out in the English Channel, trying to escape. I'll admit, this seems a little stretched. I feel that most of the information given by Donald was very jumbled and sometimes downright strange. For example, none of this actually added up with the dates Donald had given in the past. He once claimed he was born in 1798, 3 years after the death of Louis XVII, who Donald was now claiming to be. On one occasion, Donald provided a connection between himself and the theatre, even going as far as to including names from the theatre, names of people that actually existed. At the time, this seemed like a breakthrough. It seemed like the poltergeist had provided information that was actually relevant. This is until a TV guide was found with the names of the theatre actors inside, something Shirley could have quite easily obtained, or even watched the play on TV. And if she was responsible for the tapping noises, she could have passed on this information from the TV guide. Now there is the other possibility that the family wasn't dealing with one entity but many. After all, Donald had already mentioned 3 other entities: Mickey, Dopey, and Old Shaggy Roots. And as time went on, he also included James Dean, the actor who died in a car wreck in 1955. The haunting went on like this for the rest of the year, from month to month, constantly uninterrupted. 1956, the first year, seems to be the most active year. That's why I've been reading out the dates to give you a sense of how much occurred between such a small period of time. The following year of 1957 was still very active, but there were noticeable periods of time where the activity just didn't happen for months. But there was no mistaking that Donald was still there. And it was like this up until 1964, when the family moved into a new house, and of course Donald followed them. Through the years, Shirley found it hard to actually bring her boyfriend home. Some even ran away from the house in terror as Donald made his presence known to Shirley's new suitor. She claims to this day that the poltergeist stole her teenage years. But in 1964, Shirley met her now husband Derek, and they both moved away to the south coast in 1957. But this time, Donald decided to stay with the rest of the family. But Shirley did still receive messages from Donald now and again, informing her what her parents were up to back home, and vice versa. In 1968, Kitty received the last letter from Donald, simply saying, "I'm leaving." And that was that. That was the end of the haunting. Donald had simply vanished, just as he had mysteriously appeared. In a strange turn of events, Kitty actually started to miss Donald. It felt like something was missing from her life, and she couldn't help but mourn the ghostly visitor that had hung around for 12 years. She was actually quite upset, although the rest of the family were quite happy about it. Years later, in the 1980s, while Shirley was attending a craft fair, she was approached by a medium who informed her that she had a spirit of a small boy in a blue suit with red hair following her around, and he had a message to give her. The message was, "I'm sorry for all the trouble I caused." This came to a shock to Shirley. You see, years earlier, Harold Chibbett was actually visiting France when he found a postcard. Upon the postcard was a picture of the young Prince Louis, and he posted this to Shirley and her family. On the postcard, the young prince had a blue suit on, blue eyes, and a head full of strawberry blonde hair.